All right, so for the first session of our Native Plant Symposium that we've decided to go online with, we'll have two presentations today. We'll have Brent Hanson, who's the co-owner of Hanson's Garden Village in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, present a talk called Singing in the Rain, which is about Northern Wisconsin and Upper Peninsula rain gardens. And then Carol Maass will talk about a project that she's been working on to develop a pollinator garden as a service learning project. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves much more in more detail when they give their talks. So I'm gonna have Brent, you guys share your screen.
And you'll be able to put back on.
No.
I think you need to enable the screen sharing for us.
Oh yes, you're right. What are you listed under there? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. That was me. Perfect.
Okay, we're good on this end.
Great, keep
Shall
going.
I begin?
Yes, please, thank you.
All right, well, I'm Brent and I'm happy to be with everyone here on such a great topic. You are all very fortunate in that I do not plan on doing any singing over the next half hour. So here in here in the Rhinelander area, we've had some very wet years. The 7 of the top 21 wettest years have occurred since the year 2000. And it's been generally very wet since 2014. And last year, we had the highest amount of precipitation recorded for 1 year. That's on record. So we're definitely dealing with a lot of that good old rain coming down from the sky and a lot of snow, too. Some events have been fairly catastrophic. Rain gardens can fit into the picture of preventing those things long term, but generally there's other engineering practices and bioengineering practices that come into play in dealing with trying to alleviate very catastrophic situations. But rain gardens are certainly all about water quality and a number of other things. So it's hard actually to remember back a few years when we had that 8-year drought going on. But you know, the weather keeps changing. So I don't hear an awful lot about rain barrels the last few years, and I think it's because people have come to realize, many folks, that 40-gallon plastic rain barrel, you know, that you bought at Lowe's or whatever, doesn't catch very much rain. I mean, you're looking at 1,200 gallons off of like a 30 by 60 foot roof, which is pretty average with just a 1-inch rain event. So you're not going to catch very much water that way. There is a place for rainwater harvesting, but it, in my opinion, in most cases is more efficient with much larger catchment containers. But this is the sort of thing that you see on the screen that certainly can happen when soil starts moving around. And where does the water go? In this case, it goes to the lake, which is the last place we want it to go. So this was a Habitat for Humanity home. Not that I want to give them a hard time because they would do really great work. But if you look at this, you see their solar panels on the roof. It's a very efficient home, very well insulated. But down at the bottom of this shot, you'll see where the outflow is from the rain gutters, right next to the street. And of course, where does that go? To the storm sewer, and then in our case here in Rhinelander, into the Wisconsin River. That's not what we want to be doing. So here's a rain garden that we did a number of years ago for a retail customer, a residential customer. And this picture was taken just the year after, I think towards the end of the summer, the year after that it was installed. But you can see a lot of, you can't see the depression because it's so full of plants, which is the objective. You do see the berm, and you see that it's nestled off the corner of the building, and in this case, that's where the downspout from the roof gutters is coming down. So a rain garden is a landscaping method that gathers water from usually hard surfaces like rooftops, driveways, that sort of thing, but it can't even be lawns. And since the water often carries pollutants or sediments, instead of letting that go into storm sewers, directly into lakes and rivers, to other sensitive areas that you don't want it to go to, you can use this technique of using a shallow depression, and I do mean relatively shallow in almost all cases, and plants. And we really promote native plants for doing that. So everything you do, you have to measure success or failure. So a success is not only having water flow easily to a low depression that you've created and have the plants thrive so that the plants themselves and the roots can slow down water and funnel it down into the ground rather than continue screaming along the soil and going somewhere. And failure would be the other shot on the slide here, which is still a depression that catches some water, but there's no habitat value unless you count that concrete heron. And, you know, the plants aren't there. Part of the problem with this failure, by the way, was a severe deer problem, which we'll try to address that a little bit as well. And probably not, this is a very sandy area where this failure shot was. I have the feeling that there wasn't very much compost or heavier soil worked in to at least get the plants started. And even though there's been fairly frequent rains for quite a few years now, this is so sandy that it still wasn't enough to allow those plants to thrive. And you have to be careful when you look at those rain garden lists, because a lot of them are really wetland plants, which is fine if you have heavier soils or you think there's going to continue to be frequent rains. Many times these rain gardens are very, very dry between rains, and you want to alleviate that at the beginning. And I especially like good, clean compost to do that, mixed in with the soil, even though it'll disappear later, being organic, to get those plants off to a good start. And then with a good, deeper root system that goes further down into that cooler, wetter sand area, they can hang in there, and you don't have quite as much of a problem. So this particular publication was put out by the state of Wisconsin with several partners, and does a really, really good job of the basics and even going beyond the basics, which we won't have time to tonight to do things like how to figure out how to measure the size of a rain garden for a certain size roof area that you're trying to catch water from. They lay it out very, very well. So I thought you'd rather talk about plants maybe and see some slides of some work we've done. But this is a really good publication that was put out in about 2003, I believe. It's DNR publication 776-2003. You have to go online, by the way, to get that. It's no longer available in print. So one of the things that they'll point out, and I will point out, is that a rain garden is not a pond. The water that goes in there can sit for 24 to even 48 hours, and that can be okay if you plan the plant material accordingly. But if it's constantly having water in it, you've created a pond. It's not always a bad thing, but it's not the goal here. And there are other issues with mosquitoes hatching potentially and things like that that can happen if you create a pond, and you need to know about that. So right at the very beginning, before we run out of time, we should maybe talk a little bit about cost. The Wisconsin Healthy Lakes Initiative has done some cost calculations, which are a few years old, but still pretty appropriate. I think the big thing is that a 600 square foot rain garden, which I point out here, is probably going to cost you around $3,000. And even with a landscaper helping you, it can go pretty quickly. And the plant costs, because typically you're putting in one plant per square foot in these things, you plant pretty densely. And our production, our native plant production, is with 2.5-inch pots, 32 per flat. And for what we sell those for at that size, the plant cost would be about half of that $3,000 for a 600 square foot rain garden. Now, the other part of that is going to vary a lot, because if you have to bring in an excavator or do extra soil or compost, you're going to have some materials that you need to bring in. So it's going to vary, but that gives a rough idea of the budget on this thing, very rough. So where should you not put in a rain garden, I think, is one of the things that maybe isn't always addressed, because sometimes the perception is that you can throw them in almost anywhere, and you probably can. You can probably put them in at least 80% of the potential sites that are out there and not do any harm. But a lot of times people get excited about rain gardens and talk to us, and the only places they have are where they want to put them. The value is actually pretty minimal, either because you can't get the water to really go there, or for another couple of other options that won't work well. So here's a spot you definitely don't want to go to, which is like a septic area or a lift pump area. That sort of thing is going to be problematic. Next to foundations and basements, the general recommendation is that you find in these resources is to stay 10 feet away from a foundation. We would actually like to see more like 20, but so much depends on what kind of soils you have. Obviously, if they're sandy soils and the drainage is good all the way through, you can sneak pretty close to foundation. So you really have to take the type of soils into account. And by the way, it's the heavier soils that a lot of times we get called to help in for rain gardens, because they can be pretty tricky to actually do a rain garden in clay soils or heavy soils, where in sand there's potential issues you can run into too. One of them being that they'll could be way too dry for too long if you don't supply additional watering. But the lighter soils are ones where people can oftentimes kind of figure it out for themselves, or do pretty well on their own, as long as they can do the grading and create the depression. You want to be careful going right next to sidewalks and paved parking areas as well, especially if your soil's heavy. Now, many times we'll use this to catch water coming off of those sidewalks or paved areas, but we typically want it to run across some area of turf, for instance, because if you are in medium to heavy soils and you go right next to that concrete structure of, say, a sidewalk, you get the frost heave cycle, because those areas next to that sidewalk, instead of draining away well, you're actually bringing water there, and that soil is saturated, and then when it freezes, you get buckling of your sidewalk and so forth. So you got to remember that the rain gardens direct the water into the ground, which is what you want. But then the second thing is this the place where I want the water to do that, to go into the ground? Steep slopes are a problem. That we don't want that one, but steep slopes are a problem. 3 to 8% is really good to work on. Many times where rain gardens are thought of in steeper slopes is a situation where someone with a little more experience, like ourselves and other folks, get called in. You could do multiple small rain gardens, for instance, and that sort of thing. So another place that I like to stay away from, and at least not call it a rain garden, is when you're near the elevation of flowages out from reservoirs or stream systems that have a lot of fluctuation in water level, because a lot of times what you're doing is, again, creating a pond or a bay, and it stays wet much longer than what a typical rain garden is going to do. And in fact, I told a group of engineers in a talk that I actually said, hey, I'm getting sick of getting these lists of plants for rain gardens. And we find out that the plants are dying because you're sticking them down in these areas that stay wet for 3 months in a row. Part of that is maybe that some of these folks don't totally get what they're doing. They know how to make a depression, but they maybe don't understand the biological part of it all the time. And the other thing is just that it's been so wet the last few years beyond what a lot of us, I guess, would normally expect. So you keep it too wet and things happen, like the cattails move in. And this was a case where we were involved in a project where they said it was a rain garden project, but it actually was a pond project. And one of the issues they had was cattails. And we won't necessarily get into are cattails native, not native, the hybrid between the native and non-native, all of that, because they grow so vigorously that if you're looking for a diverse habitat, you actually, in my opinion, don't want cattails. If you're only looking at filtering water, they're not so bad. And studies have shown how amazing a mass of cattails is at filtering water, dirty water coming through, and then on the other end it's clean. But those are more for like manufactured wetlands. So here's an engineered wetland that we did in the U.P. So that sort of thing is a different practice and has value and can be done and does serve as a filter, which this wetland does, serves as a filter for this pond. But one of the things I like about this slide, and I also want to talk about before we run out of time, is access. Because that's something that really you don't hear people talk about when it comes to rain gardens. But just like this log here gives access to jumping into this pond, which is a lot of fun, we want people to have access through rain gardens if at all possible. And here you can see the flagstones going through what is going to become a rain garden. Here's more of a wooden platform going through. You can get much fancier than just wooden platforms. Now, why that structure? In my opinion, you'll get much more enjoyment as a human being and more of a appreciation of what's going on if you can get in there and get close. And there's certain times of the year when it's either wet a lot or the foliage and plant vegetation is up and can get quite large. In fact, it usually will with most of the species that are most appropriate. And it's pretty hard to wade in there to look for dragonflies, to look for what butterflies are in there laying eggs, just to observe things close. And for, the person that built the rain garden, for their benefit, but for kids, grandkids, all of that, I mean, it's just part of the learning process. So I really like to design in access through the rain garden or very close to it that doesn't impede the function of the rain garden. So rain gardens sometimes, like I say, won't fit in. Now here's a situation on a lake where we had to do EnviroLock, which is one of the things that we do. That's that bag wall. It is a vegetated system, and we're not talking about that today, so I'll leave it at that. But then the slope going down to the lake, we ended up using erosion blanket and planting through it, and that turned out to be more appropriate in this site. You can also do these Excelsior sediment logs and create water bars with compost and plants put behind them, slows the water down, and then the plants eventually take off. And even on very dry sites where it's hard to get plants established, these water bars, these collection points for both water and organic material, do pretty well at giving you permanent vegetative bars, because eventually that sediment log disappears. So some rain gardens. Our rain garden is right off the gutter of one of our greenhouses, and of course it's a lot closer than 10 feet to the building. But for the structure that we have there, that doesn't really matter. You want to place your rain gardens, though, typically a little bit farther away than we did with that greenhouse one that I just showed you. And here's a situation where there's quite a few options. You want to try to work with the lay of the land, and you can see here they do have the land graded away from the building, and the slope isn't too terrible. This looks to be probably about 8% or so. It's right on the edge of what I would call an easy installation for rain gardens. Because remember, on a really steep slope, one of the things you're going to deal with is you got to dig down to create that flat floor of the rain garden in the upper slope and move it to the lower slope to create the back berm that keeps everything from washing out of there. And the steeper the slope, the more digging you're going to have to do, and which matters, especially if you're doing it by hand. And some slopes are just too steep. So the only reason I got herbicides in here, because we typically prefer to just scrape the sod off, either with a sod cutter or with machinery, like a skid steer or something like that. There are other options. A lot of folks don't care for Roundup or glyphosate. There's a citric acid-based product called Burnout that works pretty well, but I do prefer just scraping off existing sod. One of the reasons I put the slide in here is to remind myself to mention that one of the biggest problems with rain gardens out in lawns is that there's no neutral zone between the lawn that continues to be there and the rain garden itself. And the worst thing is to have turf grasses move from out in the lawn, which they will, both by seed and by the tillers running, down into your rain garden and competing with your native plants. And those turf grasses will love it in there and get like a pasture. You don't want that. So a lot of times we will have a fairly barren area on the berm or edge of the rain garden where we'll put a few low shrubs like blueberries or something like that, and actually mulch it with like a cedar mulch or some other wood mulch, and you actually police that. It's like a demilitarized zone. As the grasses grow through that, which you'll see the shallow grasses starting to creep into it, you keep pulling it out. But it gives you a place where you can observe what's going on, and keep those grasses out of your rain garden. And that's pretty important in a lawn situation. Otherwise, after 3-4 years, you got nothing but trouble. And your mowing of the lawn isn't going to keep the grass out of there. And in fact, usually it makes it worse because so many times people don't watch which way the mower is throwing the clippings. And then they throw those clippings, which contain grass seed and so forth, sometimes right into the rain garden areas. And that really exasperates things. So you want to call Digger's Hotline for sure. In Wisconsin or Michigan, they've got very similar systems, but make sure you do it when you're digging on your property. So we really love compost, and aged manure is okay if it really is aged and clean. You can tell that this must be a Northwoods invention here, especially with the snowmobiles around it. But compost, if it's clean, is really good thing to work with. It does disappear after a while, but it does so much to get plants started. This is taken out of that rain garden manual that I showed the cover of before, and just gives you an idea of the sort of information that's in there, and is also in some other materials that are out there online and printed. And that it would be so hard to do this talking, in this presentation, and all that information is there. So, this just gives you an idea of how you start at the top of the slope, dig down, pull your soil down to create the berm, and use a string level or some way to make sure that you know what your level bottom of that rain garden is. It's always a good thing to try to create that. We don't always stick with that. So, we do sort of bend some of the rules with the things we do, which you can do when you're real familiar with a particular practice. You can sort of bend things around a little bit to what you want to do. Because a lot of times we like to create one part of the floor of the rain garden that's a little bit deeper, and probably will stay a little bit wetter to get a little bit different group of plant material to be happy there. So I think we'll just go through this one. So when we do these rain gardens, we really like Curlex Net Free, which is an aspen fiber that's spun into a blanket, and there's no cross netting at all. There's longitudinal netting, but no cross netting. This is produced by American Excelsior Corporation out of Rice Lake, Wisconsin. And it's, a renewable product, presumably, that it's made from, and it really works great as a mulch material. But when you put that down in the rain garden, you can make a hole with your hands. You don't have to cut through plastic netting and that sort of thing when you try to plant through straw blankets. You just make a hole in there, put your plant plug in at 1 foot spacing, which is close. You can see what this is here. And it serves as holding the moisture in, kind of anchoring the plants. And it isn't just going to wash out of the basin of the rain garden like so many materials I see people trying to use. Like, we love loose mulch or wood mulch on the berms, like I talked about for the neutral zone that we like around the rain gardens. There it's good. But in the floor of the rain garden, you can get washing, because sometimes you shouldn't get a lot of washing depending on how you design this, but you get a big gully washer, you can get a lot of water coming into a rain garden, and it'll tend to push all your wood mulch to one end of the rain garden typically. And that won't happen if you use netting like this. Now, you can't always get this net free very easily. So if you're sourcing this product, it's an erosion blanket is what you're looking for with your supplier. And any BioNet erosion blanket will pretty much work like this will. And you can use the plastic netted straw blankets and that sort of thing, but you're not going to like what you have to do to try to plant through it. And most of those straw blankets aren't that high quality anyway, in my opinion. So here you see a rain garden with net free down at the base, and then on the sides you'll see where there's a berm is created with the wood mulch. And we really, really like cedar from our region here, actually from the U.P. It's harvested, the trees are harvested in Forest Service properties mostly, and presumably that's a renewable operation as well. Okay, so do you need deer fencing? You have to protect the plants from the deer in so many places. So just keep that in mind. So this is North Lakeland Discovery Center on Manitous Waters, Wisconsin, and they contracted with us to deal with roof runoff. So this is the early stage of the development. There's drain tile perforated drain tile down in that rock gullyway that's catching the water coming off the roof. And a lot of the water then does soak directly into the ground, but it is also directed gradually down into a rain garden that you'll see down on the end of everything. And then there's one particular area where the roof lines come together on the building where the water is concentrated. So we created some rocks that actually catch the water and splash them up in the air to kind of create a splash effect just for the fun of it. And there's a lot of school kids and stuff that go to this. I don't know if they're always there when the rain events happen, but and of course we had to set the rocks so that the splash didn't come back in their faces. And here we get down to the lower end, the termination. You can see the terminations of the drain tiles, and that's the basin of the rain garden. And there's some plants that will go in there. And on our website, which will be, it's just hansonsgardenvillage.com, and it'll be listed at the end of this presentation. We have materials on our website with native plant lists that we think are great for rain gardens, and then a general native list that can also be used because it'll talk about light levels that the plants are happy in and also the moisture regimes of the soil. Because those rain gardens, they're not all just wetland plants. You have to make some real decisions, like if you're up on the berm or if you're in heavier soils and lots of water is getting directed into this rain garden, you may need more of a wetland type of plant. So choosing the right plants, as so often in any kind of landscaping or gardening, is what it's all about when trying to decide what to use. So this is a few years after. Sometimes it takes a little time for these plants to fill in. We even got sumac in there. So cup plant is going to be quite tolerant of medium to fairly wet conditions. New Jersey tea is like medium to dry. And so this area was sort of a middle of the road moisture situation in our opinion. And we used both plants and both did pretty well in the long run. Bush honeysuckle will actually go from dry to fairly moist. And that's a native shrub, although it grows almost more like a ground cover in many cases, but it's a shrub. And then the dogwoods, what you want to do is you want to pick the dogwood that's going to work as far as if you want a lot of suckering and spreading of stems, which in some cases you want the plants to be very exuberant. Then you want Cornus sericea, but not Bailey. Bailey was a naturally discovered variation of Cornus sericea that does very little suckering. And actually Bailey's nursery out of Minnesota latched onto that and started propagating them because in some garden situations you don't want your red stem dogwood patch to just kind of try to take over the world. So you've got an option when you're purchasing this plant material and still staying within pretty much natural, close to native plant type of decisions, because this was a naturally found variation of what kind of suckering outgrowth that you want from these plants in some cases. Okay. And there was no berm at North Lakeland Discovery Center because the topography didn't call for a berm being necessary to keep the water from overflowing. So if you don't need it, you don't use it. We still needed that neutral area out there along the edge of that lawn though, even though it wasn't bermed up. And this is protecting water quality. You can see the lake that is beyond State House Lake, I believe it is, that's beyond the lawn there. So this is in 2015. So I don't know what, it's 6 years late after the original installation. So you can see the seed heads forming right in the middle there from fireweed. Used to be Epilobium angustifolia, now they've got a new genus name for it. And then to the left and the right, you'll see the flowers of Monarda fistulosum, the wild bee balm. So even with native plants, we talk about invasive plants and how they'll take over everything and push out the natives and everything. You can have some very aggressive native plants as well. And when you're working with these things as a designer, you have to keep what your goals are in mind. Sometimes you you want or need very aggressive native plants because it's going to be a tough situation anyway, and you want as tough a customer as you want in there. Other times you feel pretty comfortable that your plants will do well, and you want a lot of diversity potentially, and then you don't necessarily want the real plant thugs, even if they're natives. So that epilobium in the middle there, the fireweed, is on the more aggressive side, to say the least. So you have to be a little careful unless there's going to be ongoing maintenance, because at North Lakeland Discovery Center, there is a pretty good amount of ongoing maintenance, some of which is involved with us and some with their volunteers and staff there. So that helps to keep things in check. But there are situations, especially if the moisture regime is just right, which is moist but not in a pond type situation, it can really take over and become a monoculture. The Monarda, the wild bee balm with the bluish, lavenderish blue flowers, is also quite an active grower, but it plays better with other plants. And so you can use that one, I think, with more impunity, no matter what your goals for diversity are. A couple that you don't see on here that scare me a lot is like turtlehead, Chelonia glabra, and another one would be great blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. Those plants in conditions that stay fairly moist will really, really fill in and prevent other plants, in my opinion, from spreading very well, or spreading from seed, or even from rhizomes and tillers. They just grow so actively. So you want to think twice about whether you want to use those, even though those plants are probably on our website on the list of plants for using in rain gardens. It is really difficult to get all the information out there because there are situations where you would want to use it. So this project worked out well as far as effectively capturing this rough water and doing something valuable with it. And they have weddings there and, you know, do all kinds of fun things. It's worked out quite well. And there's that cup plant that you saw next to that New Jersey tea in that previous slide, just as a little starter plant. And those of you that know cup plants know how humongous it is. But I mean, the birds just love it. They get their water out of the leaves, the entire leaves that come together on the stem. The bees and the butterflies love the flowers. It can spread around quite a bit from seed though. We use it usually in sort of a focus area, but don't be spreading it nilly-willy through your whole planting unless you, again, just want the whole planting to be taken over by cup plant, because it seeds all over the place. But it's so beautiful and so valuable, I feel, from a habitat standpoint, that it's always nice to be able to use some as an accent. So that's in the bowl of the rain garden, and that's at 6 years after planting. So I'd like to think that when we saw the slide earlier about the success and failure, I'd sure like to think this is a success. So we talked a little bit about heavy soils. This Ashland has that Lake Superior clay, Ashland, Wisconsin. And these were some landowners in city of Ashland. Very heavy soil, and the water would sit, especially in the spring, in their lawn and truly create a lake. And it was so bad that it would end up killing the lawn totally. They'd have water coming in their basement. Those trees would start getting stressed out. So they must have felt they didn't have any other choice. They actually would put a pump out there in that low area and pump the water out onto the street. And this is up on the slopes above Chequamegon Bay. So that street was leading right down to Lake Superior. And they knew that that wasn't a great thing to do. And they had a few things going on, like snow in the mountain, which is now in Wisconsin on the NR40 list. So it's illegal to sell, and it's considered an invasive plant. It's certainly not a native. So what we did here is we actually created, almost like a French drain, we created a larger area with geotextile, a cavity, filled it with 1.5 inch rock, used the geotextile to keep the fines in the soil from plugging up that rock. And then we put a canister type pump well, I called it, inside of that, nestled in the rock with a lid. And then we ran the drain tiles that to a pretty large degree were feeding the water into this lawn area. We put the lid on it because and put our path close to it so you could open it up and look into there easily to monitor what the water levels were, because you can just pop that lid off and look down in there, and at least for the depth of that pump well, which I think was about 2 feet if I remember right, you would be able to see if there's water in the bottom of it or whatever. And then, because we wanted them to monitor what this thing was doing. They were really the owners were really into how this thing was working. And also, I called it a pump well because in an extreme situation, and this one we did a fair number of years ago, so it looks 2012, I think they only had to pump once, and I never asked if they pumped it out into the street again or somewhere else. But early on in the life of this thing, I believe they had to pump one time because the water was turning into a bit of a pond again. So what's the secret about this? It was just using this little design here is not so much the secret. The secret was using the right plants, because early on we felt we needed that extra holding capacity of the water and a way to monitor it, because we knew it would take time for the plants to perform and get good, deep, heavy roots. And even in heavy clay soils, we have found that once those plants get a very massive, extensive root system going down, they keep functioning better and better. And you can actually get the plants to give you a good draining rain garden in some pretty heavy clay type situations. Now, that doesn't mean you can go down to the stream side level in heavy soil and be right down in the water table and think that you're going to do something that's magical, that works against physics. I mean, that's not going to happen. But you can go on the heavier soils than you think you can if you're patient and you use the right plants with the right kind of root systems that are going to work in those heavy soils, and be patient, because you're not going to have the root systems that are going to give you that drainage in the first season or two. It's going to take a few years. So we used a lot of dogwoods there. We used sedges. Swamp aster is one that we really like. The sedge that you see in the front of the picture looks like Carex crenita, caterpillar sedge. It goes by some other names. We really like that plant. The spikenard was more off to the side of the rain garden, but it has a shallow spreading root system that I'm sure was helping with the moisture. It looks like swamp aster there. There's a pathway going through next to the pump well, but also giving access. And this is, when I get up to Ashland, I swing by and look at this. This has gotten fuller and nicer as time goes on. It seems to take a while longer in heavy soil, just like it does in real light sandy soils. If you've got like a mesic sandy loam or something, ideal soil, that's when plants really take off. Bog goldenrod. So sometimes goldenrods fit the category of native plants that also are almost too thuggish to use in natural plantings. Canada goldenrod really scares me, even though it's native. I'd much rather use stiff goldenrod. I like gray goldenrod, Solidago nemorosa, and I like bog goldenrod. It'll take the wet conditions, the cycling of wet and dry as well, and isn't, nearly the thug that, say, Shoei or Canada goldenrod is. And we offer, I think, both species, but because there are places for them, but we just hope that they don't get into the wrong place. It's still going to be a native plant and help pollinators and everything, but it will tend to take over, but not so much this one, bog goldenrod. We had gentians along the side, because who can argue with being able to look at bottle gentians? Okay, so this was one we did for Forest County Potawatomi.
Brent, it kills me, but we're running short on time, and this is so hard because these are great examples, but I feel like I should keep us on time in terms of moving
Yeah, absolutely.
along. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which it
Because
hurts,
I
though.
totally, I totally lost track of it. So, should I quit right now or just blow through these?
If you just want to give people the visual, and maybe we can post your slides on the page if that would be okay with you, and people can kind of, I think just being able to tag through these and see the before and after is tremendous if you'd be willing to do that.
Okay. So remember that the berms on the side of these rain gardens can sometimes be pretty dry. So here's the butterfly weed, which really likes it dry along the berm. So I was almost finished, but I hope I didn't run over too much.
No, we're fine. I know, and people are commenting like, well, what else are we going to do? But I know people are also juggling kids and other things too.
Yeah.
Go
Oh
ahead.
yeah. No.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
So this will be on this presentation for people to be able to retrieve later, I guess. So here's a couple of resources, and this is us, and there's also resources available here at Hanson's Garden Village. And I thank you.
Great, thanks, Brent. And I do apologize that we do want to keep things at least so that way we're not going.
Oh no,
super over.
I totally understand.
What I'll do is, and I did put your website in the URL in there, and it was great. We'll get some of these resources posted. We can share the rain garden publication. Well, I'll ask you one or two questions. If you want to stop sharing, we'll have Carol share her screen, and in the meantime, I can ask you one or two questions that came in.
Okay.
One was, have you ever tried hugelkultur? Like burying wood as kind of the down slope or kind of bottom berm to make the downhill berm.
I would have to say, yeah, I'd have to say yes and no. No, from the standpoint that we've never called it that, and I maybe don't know all the technicalities of that particular practice, but we worked with Wisconsin DNR Science Services Bureau when they still existed, with a lot of woody material studies, and some of that got published. Offhand, I can't remember the references on that, but I'm guessing, and I'm a great believer in wood. I mean, don't get me, we'll really run out of time if I start talking about wood, especially using wood in the lakes, but I'm all for that. Yeah, so I don't want to speak too much to it because I have an appreciation for what you're probably talking about, but I wouldn't want to portray myself as sort of an expert or practitioner of it.
Great. And then one other super quick question. It looks like Carol's queued up, but I can share while you're doing that, I'll share the rain garden document. Is just a sense of how much ongoing maintenance weeding does the ashland planting require, just for people who are maybe thinking like, this looks beautiful, but what does it mean, you know, on a monthly basis? Right.
Well, they love it, and I would say they probably put a total of, for two older people, they probably put a total of 8 hours a year into the maintenance, divided up between different times. So it can be very low maintenance. If you keep the lawnmower from blowing the clippings in there and have that demilitarized zone that I was talking about, and if you're not near an existing source of invasives that are just going to seed right into it, because that obviously will give you trouble right from the get-go. It can be pretty low maintenance, and choosing the right plant materials, which is kind of a hand-in-hand sort of thing where you almost have to either have a lot of that knowledge or work with us or do a lot of research, because picking the right plants is really critical.
Great. Great.
Especially, and that leads towards the low maintenance end of it too.
That's great advice in terms of a lot of planning up front, you know, pound of prevention or ounce of prevention kind of thing. Thank you very much. This was great. We have your website up. We have these other pieces. It was fantastic. Next, we're going to turn over to Carol Maass, who's going to talk about a project that she's been doing with her work at Friends of the Porkies to use pollinators as a service learning project. And we did this sort of similar to what we do at the Native Plant Symposium in person, which is, you know, kind of pair some of these longer, more technical presentations with these examples of kind of gardens in action. So Carol, I'll let you take it away. Hopefully we can we hear you? I might have muted you at one point. There, now you should be able to talk, Carol.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So welcome everybody, and I'm really excited to be here. This is something that we've been doing, the Friends of the Porkies has been doing with our local third grade classroom at Ontonagon area schools, and just thought it would be a good thing to share with everybody, having been to 2 of the native plant symposiums, because we're really excited and about how this has worked out for us. So first off the bat, what is a service learning project? A service learning project, or service learning, is a teaching technique in which the students participate in a community service activity that is related to objectives of a classroom curriculum. Our president, Sally Berman, is a long-time educator, and she's actually written books about service learning projects. And so when she found out that I wanted to use classroom students to create pollinators gardens for the park, she was really excited, and she really pulled it all together for us of how to set this up as a service learning project. And a service learning project has a community service goal, and ours was to create pollinators gardens at Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park. I noticed that there's some people on from Baraga and from other places downstate. I hope that you can see this presentation as a way that you can do the same sort of thing with your local school in your state park, if they're desiring to have pollinators gardens. The curriculum objectives, sorry, for the Ontonagon area school third graders were to understand why humans need pollinators, be able to identify who are the pollinators, learn how to plant a garden, learn about the need for knowledge about the soil, the sun, the moisture, and the plant size, and other requirements for a garden attractive to pollinators. So the first thing is the park as a partner and the process. Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park identifies each year the garden location. This would have been the 4th year that we've done a garden for them, using third graders, and the first year we used another group, which you'll see later on. And so we've learned a few lessons, and one of the things is they'd locate where they first wanted the garden. The first year they wanted it at the Wilderness Visitor Center on either side of the door. The next year they asked us to put it over, build 2 in 2 subsequent years in the new shower house. The park interpreter, as part of this partnership, does 2 classroom visits talking about pollinators. First of all, why we need pollinators. Then the person comes in a couple weeks later into the classroom and does an activity and a talk about who are the pollinators. The park supplies on-site support for the garden, tools, and that sort of thing. The Friends raises about $500, sometimes a little bit more, for plants and materials. In 2018, a little shout out to the Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition, because they funded this project as a grant, with a grant for $500. The Friends prepare the garden bed as soon as the weather allows, and the Friends help the students plan the garden in mid-April. We do the planning in mid-April in order so that we can order the certified plant materials by late April. The Friends also go in and we teach how to create puddling stones for their gardens, and about the need for water, for pollinators' need for water, and how it's different than a bird bath. And then how you actually plant the plants. The Friends also leads the planting day at the end, which happens at the end of May. And the Friends then gets volunteers to water and weed the gardens throughout the summer. In past years, 2 different years, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you can see the Conserve School kids from Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin, come up, and they've traditionally been created our bed for our pollinators garden. And then you'll also see a puddling stone there up in the upper right corner. The school, Christy Pesca from Ontonagon area school, our third grade teacher, prepared the classroom curriculum. She also had received a grant and has a hydroponic garden that she has in her classroom with the kids that she works through in the second half of the school year. She works with the park interpreter, with the Friends Master Gardeners, there's 2 of them that work on this project, and a U.S. Forest Service wildlife biologist to integrate classroom visits with the curriculum. She makes all the arrangements for the planting field trip and lunch break, and we conclude the whole, it usually takes about a half a day to plant the garden and then have lunch, and then we do a hike on a nature trail looking at the actual plants in the wild. So that's kind of fun. This is last year's 2019 group. Planting the garden in the classroom. This is something that it's taken us a few refinements to get to, but it's really working out well. And I think you could do it with any age group. You could just make it a little bit more complex as you got into a older children or older people. One of the things we do is we identify the garden sunlight, what kind of light it gets, soil type, moisture, and what kind of pests they can expect in the garden. And for us, the pests for those gardens down by the shower house was heavy deer mowing. We also use Prairie Nursery because the park has requested us to use them because it's a preferred certified plant source. We also like to order our plant stock from Prairie Nursery because we don't order seeds, we're ordering plants that are 3 years old, so they have good root stock and they are able to survive the first summer with almost little to no maintenance and help. On the right, you'll see that the kind of information I pull right out of the Prairie Nursery catalog each year, or a year, and I put the plants, make a sheet like this of the plants showing the kind of information that I pulled out of Prairie Nursery. And you'll see this more later on. Oops, sorry. And then the other thing we do is we identify each plant's height, how tall is it, season of bloom, what color is it, how far apart is it supposed to be, its spacing. And then when we're actually in the field planting, we talk about root types and we talk about who benefits from this. What kind, is it bees, is it butterflies, what is it that it is? And what I do when I pull these things out and I print them off on my computer, and then I put them on construction paper that matches the colors that they are. So it's color coded. So black-eyed Susan, yellow, ironweed, and I do the whole series, I'll do 5 or 6, depending upon how many or of the plant we are buying. And of 5 purple ironweed, 6 black-eyed Susan, and we take them into the classroom. And the first year, which I call method 1, we gave the children all the plants to arrange together. And we gave them yardsticks and we told them things like you should try to have them, pay attention to how far apart these plants are supposed to be. And you want some of the plants next to each other. You want the tallest plants inside. And they used the yardsticks to measure in space. And the second method we tried is each child, we put tape on the floor for the size of the garden. Each child was given one type of plant and they focused on the height and the season of bloom, and there were no yardsticks. The second group really worked out well. They worked together as a team, adjusted others. They said, oh, mine's really tall, I'm gonna put it in the middle, and I'm gonna put my purple ones here, but let's make a little bit of an S curve, and they really engaged in that effort. From the classroom to the planting, I'll go back. I take multiple photos of the layout that's on the ground or on the school floor, and I create a map on craft paper of what they plan and how they plan to plant, what their plan was to plant the flowers. And then we use those same photos and color coding along the wall. And we put, this year we didn't do it, but the next year we found out it was a good idea. We put the plants underneath there for them to find. The first year, this year, that's Marilyn Knutson, Master Gardener. She actually comes out of Tomahawk, Wisconsin. The first year, we had 30 some students because it was a third and fourth grade combined that year. And so we tried, if you look, I'm not sure if you can see it, but one group did very straight lines and the other group was more creative. We actually split the two when we got there. Bob Wild, the park interpreter, took half for a walk and the other half planted half of the garden, and then we switched and went back. The second year, planting day, you can see once again, we have the map up above, we have the plants hung on the wall, and we had all the plants underneath their photos so the kids can refer back to the photo and the description and where they're putting and how they're putting their plants on the ground. So we have the planting plan, we have the plant posters, we arranged plants under their posters. This year we discovered, because of the year before, some complications, we decided that we were going to use weed barrier and cut with scissors where the plants go. We divided into areas. Each group of children got an area, and they worked from the sides to the center. It really worked out very well this way in getting it planted. Some of the lessons learned are do use weed barrier. The children, if you look in the lower left photograph, seem more aware of where their bodies are and the plants are. And there was less trampling of plants and kind of stepping back on somebody else's plant, more cooperation, more working together on their area, and it worked out really well. The surface allows them to sort of pre-place the plants where they've planned, where their plan was to put the plants, and look at the layout and put the plants out there, and it really works very slick. You do end up with all your scissors that you've brought with your name on it, so every time you go into the drawer, you pull out a scissors with your name on it, but it still works. Lessons learned, take lots of photos of printing the map, for drawing out the map. When the children see that their plan, which is the plan in the classroom, mid-April, and then they get out there and they're actually following their plan. And when they get all done and it's set up and their puddling stone is sitting there waiting for butterflies to land on, it's really, they really see how it moves, how their initial idea and planning of where they wanted to put that ironweed, where they wanted to put the butterfly weed is coming forward, and they're seeing it in the ground. So some really good lessons learned that I think people need to be aware of is identify and prepare the site the fall before. You never know when the snow will melt. The first year we were delayed a lot because the snow didn't, in 2017, because the snow didn't melt and we couldn't get in there to prepare the soil, and the classrooms were gone by the time we had to. To plan the garden and to order the right number of plants, and figure out how many plants you're going to need, you need the dimensions of that garden. So that's where you need to, prepare and plan ahead of time where you're going to do it. This is the shower house where we did the garden that's labeled A in 2018 and B in 2019. Most of the pictures you saw previously were the B garden. Another lesson learned is use older classes, or in our case, we used the get volunteers from the Conserve School to prepare the site. It's a lot of work to prepare the site depending upon where it is. The shower house gardens were filled with a lot of construction debris, and the visitor center garden, which you're seeing here, had a lot of roots and was very compact. So very different, and very different soils between the two also. Planting with young children is fun. They get so excited, but you need to have about one adult for every child or two. And when you tell them to make sure they bring work gloves, they might bring their pink winter gloves instead, but you just smile and let them do that. And if you follow the steps of creating your construction paper plants that you help them learn which ones they are, and you make your map and you prepare your bed and you bring your classroom out, you can be very successful. The garden on the left side with the puddling stones was planted in the spring of 2019, and that's what it looked like in the July of 2019. And then the upper right one is what it looked like a little bit later in August, early August. The one on the left, or excuse me, in the center on the bottom, has been problematic. It was planted in 2018 and water comes rushing down the sidewalk, and we really should have had a little bit of Brent Hanson's rain garden information for planting in that one. And then it's always important to add the little interpretive sign also. And for the students and their families and the public, it really is and has been a very successful project that the Friends have carried on for 4 years now. It's something that the park is thrilled to have. The visitors are all excited to see, and the kids and the community come back or come out to the visitor center and they see what they've done themselves, and they're really excited about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. That was really great. One of the questions we had was about you had said you had used the plastic, and so they were asking, if you remove the plastic, but I think it's landscape fabric, and so I wondered if you wanted to just provide a little bit of detail about what kind of landscape fabric you use and maybe how much mulch you put on top.
We were pressed for time, so we got stuff from Ace Hardware that year. If we were to, of course, this year we had to cancel it, but we were buying a better quality of landscape fabric for the next garden, and because it was what we had. The other thing is the first 2 gardens, we didn't mulch at all, and that was fine. But we found with the landscape fabric and the wind and the rain that we were having that we needed to mulch. We also found that the last year was extremely dry in the first couple months of the year, like June and half of July. And we were lucky that one of the campground rangers adopted the garden, and she would water it every time she was on duty. So that was great, because that helped it survive much better than it would have. If
Great.
anybody has any recommendations on landscape fabric that's not your stuff, garden variety, I would, I'd appreciate knowing about that.
Great. I think I got maybe two other questions here, or maybe two or three. There were a couple others. One was, how much kind of correcting coaching do the kids need with their classroom plans? And so, you know, how much are you kind of steering them versus they're doing it themselves?
They were pretty, when we had the large group, there was a lot more where you had to kind of watch and help them. And I attribute a lot of that just to the number of kids and to their, just the number of kids and the fact that we didn't have any fabric for them to kind of be able to see it and know their bounds. The other, there's, you know, because classrooms are mixed and there are some special needs people in children in classrooms too. So sometimes you have to help some a little more than others, but some are just, they're really good. And I'd say after we planted the 2019 garden, Marilyn and I maybe adjusted like 10% of the plants, if that. So I think that's pretty good.
Yeah. And who maintains them? Is that you guys?
Yes, in fact, we're going to be sending out to our members to see if some local people will go out and maintain them. And we need to get more mulch on that one for at least another year. And yeah, we maintain them. The park staff, whether it's at the visitor center or the shower house at the campground, also kind of adopt these gardens too, which is fun. And they'll do some of the watering, but the one really needs some weeding this year. So we're going to get individuals to adopt each garden is what we're going to do, and take it on their own to go out and take care of them.
Great. Great. And then the last question, you might not know because it's more on maybe what the teacher does, but do you know if the you know, if the kids do any other work in terms of recording pollinators that visit the gardens, or if, you know, that component of kind of follow-up is carried through it all?
Well, the garden, we're actually 15 miles, the park is 15 miles from the school. They do go out because there is the school forest, and they do go outside and talk about, look for pollinators outside. We do have, and I wish I could have found it, Maria. There's about 3 years ago, there was a big migration through of painted lady butterflies. And there's a movie that the park has on their Facebook page that just shows 100 of them on the one garden that they had there. But I'm not,
Great.
I guess you would have to talk, I'd have to find out more from Christy as to what she's doing with pollinators.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it was some of the questions that people were interested in. They were really excited in the comments about seeing, you know, the work with the students and bringing them in so much, and kind of also it's sounding like it's a really integrated part of their, you know, program, that they're getting exposure beyond this particular project. So thanks so much for sharing it with us.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so, yeah, everyone, thank you so much for coming. I think we can call it an evening, or maybe even get outside while the sun's still out, since the days are getting long. But thanks so much for all of you for coming. Thank you very much for our speakers. So Brent Hanson, remember Hanson's Garden Village in Rhinelander. I hear it's amazing, and people from up here in Houghton go 2.5, 3 hours to see it. And then Carol Maass with her project as well. So thank both of you very much. We're going to have 2 more presentations next Thursday, April April 30th. We'll be hearing about monarchs and milkweeds and more native plants to support pollinators. And so you can go to our Keweenaw Land Trust website in terms of being able to register for that event next week. And we'll also post some of the materials and hopefully soon the video recording from this presentation. So that will be the link that we'll use to keep all of this information online on the Keweenaw Land Trust's website. We'll also make that available for Master Gardeners. If you're in Michigan, this does count for credit. If you're in Wisconsin, I don't know, but I can help. And then thank you also, or for folks who are interested in learning more, definitely check out your local Wild Ones chapter. So in the Keweenaw, Marcia Goodrich has been leading our new chapter that covers our area, but there's one in the central UP and northern Wisconsin. So definitely check out that as an organization who has a lot more resources on this. Thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.